Have you ever wondered why there are people who seem to feel the world more deeply than everyone around them, yet often become the ones most lost within their own inner world? Why are there empaths who almost always know who is heartbroken, who is hiding pain, who needs to be heard, yet one day suddenly begin feeling like strangers to themselves? And why do so many people, after a period of spiritual awakening, not become lighter as they once imagined, but instead begin transforming into someone completely different? Carl Jung believed that people do not truly change by becoming someone else. They change when the parts that were forgotten, buried, or never allowed to live begin returning. And perhaps that is where the central question of today's video emerges. What empaths become after spiritual awakening? What does an empath truly become after awakening? Do they become stronger, colder, more distant, or do they finally simply return to the person they never had the chance to become? In today's video, we are going to step into that journey together. Not the journey of some mystical power appearing after awakening, but the journey where an empath slowly loses their old version of themselves in order to meet someone who has always been there for a very long time, yet was never truly seen. And perhaps somewhere within this story, you may also encounter yourself, encounter the parts that were forgotten, and the questions that have quietly been waiting for answers for a very long time. Are you ready to step into that journey? Number 1. The empath before awakening. A person existing through others. There is something very strange about empaths that Carl Jung observed through many years of working with people. They often appear as individuals who understand others better than anyone else, yet barely understand themselves. They walk into a room and almost immediately sense who is sad, who is anxious, who is trying to appear strong, and who is hiding something behind a smile. They feel shifts in the atmosphere before anyone even speaks. They notice tiny fluctuations in tone of voice, eye contact, or silence that most people would overlook. But what is remarkable is that while they can read others with extraordinary clarity, they often remain uncertain about their own inner world. And perhaps this is also where the central question of today's topic begins to emerge. When we ask, what empaths become after spiritual awakening? What an empath becomes after spiritual awakening? Many people immediately think about what happens after awakening arrives: boundaries, strength, change, or a more mature version of oneself. But Jung seemed to always begin somewhere else. He did not begin with the person after transformation. He began by looking very closely at the person before transformation happened. Because in order to understand what a person becomes, one must first understand how they used to live. Jung observed that an empath before awakening lives almost entirely from the outside inward, meaning their sense of value is not created from inner stability or from a grounded center deep within their psyche. Instead, it is formed through the reactions of others toward them. If someone needs them, they feel meaningful. If someone seeks them out, they feel valuable. And if someone is hurting and feels better after speaking with them, they experience a sense that their existence has once again been confirmed. At first glance, this looks very much like love. It resembles kindness, depth, or a rare capacity for empathy that not everyone possesses. But Jung saw something more subtle beneath all of this, because he recognized that many empaths do not truly live through a felt sense of themselves. Instead, They live through reflections from others, seeing themselves through the eyes, emotions, and needs of the external world more than through connection with their own soul. In some way, they resemble people who spend their entire lives standing before countless doors belonging to others, patiently knocking, entering, listening, repairing, and healing, yet never truly stepping into their own room to see what is happening inside. This creates a very strange paradox. A person can become an emotional refuge for everyone else, yet have no idea what to do when only they remain. They become the listener for everyone's confessions, yet have never sat down long enough to ask themselves one very simple question: what do I need? It sounds small, but perhaps it is one of the most difficult questions for many empaths. Because when someone spends too many years living as an emotional radar for the world, they gradually lose the ability to recognize the signals coming from their own soul. Perhaps you have met someone like this, or perhaps at some point you yourself have been that person. The person who always remembers everyone's birthday, yet forgets to care for themselves. The person who always notices when others are exhausted, but does not realize they themselves have been drained for a very long time. The person who can stay awake until 2 in the morning, listening to friends cry, yet when they themselves feel sad, they do not know whom to call, not because no one is there for them, but because they have become so accustomed to being the giver that they slowly forgot how to become the receiver. I once knew a woman like that, the kind of person everyone seemed to seek whenever life became difficult. Friends called her after breakups, co-workers came to her when they had problems, and family members turned to her whenever something needed solving. Strangely enough, she almost always appeared at the right moment, always knew exactly what to say, and always had an ability to make people feel better after leaving, to the point that over time she became the kind of person who appeared in someone's life precisely when they most needed saving. But then, during a very ordinary conversation, someone unexpectedly asked her what seemed like an incredibly simple question: "How have you been lately?" And something strange happened. She became silent for a very long time. Not because she did not want to answer, or because she had not heard the question, but because deep inside, she genuinely did not know how to respond. Because for a very long time, almost no one had asked her about herself. People only came to her when they needed someone to listen, needed advice, or needed someone to help them through difficulties. She knew how others were feeling. She knew her co-workers were stressed, knew her mother was sad, knew her best friend was pretending to be fine despite carrying deep wounds inside. But when she turned back toward herself, she felt completely empty and almost unable to name her own emotions. She did not know whether she was tired, sad, or had become exhausted long ago. And that very moment caused her to break down in tears, not because of pain or despair, but because for the first time she realized that she had spent so many years looking outward at the world that she had almost forgotten how to turn inward and look within herself. Perhaps the closest image for this state is a mirror placed in the middle of a crowded square, where all day long it reflects the faces of hundreds of people passing by, the joyful, the sorrowful, the tired, and the happy, recording everything and reflecting everything. But after many years of doing so, the mirror begins facing a strange question. If no one stood before it anymore, would it still know what it truly was? Many empaths live like that mirror because they exist through reflection. They know what the world is feeling, yet do not know who they are when the world becomes silent. Because what is difficult to recognize about empaths is not that they love others too much, but that sometimes they unconsciously hand their entire inner compass over to the outside world to such a degree that they stop asking, "What am I feeling?" and instead begin living with another question. What do others need from me? But Jung noticed a very strange truth. Any psychological structure built entirely upon the reactions of the outside world is extremely fragile, because sooner or later, the world becomes quiet. There comes a time when no one needs you as they once did. There comes a moment when you are alone in a silent room, and for the first time, there are no emotions left to read, no one left to save, no one left to reflect back to you who you are. And perhaps that is where the true awakening journey begins. Not when an empath learns how to feel others, but when they are forced to learn how to feel themselves. Number 2. The outward-facing wound, where empaths are truly created. And if the previous section showed how an empath gradually loses themselves because they become too accustomed to living through reflections from the outside world, then perhaps the next question naturally emerges as well. What caused a person, from a very early age, to learn how to observe others more than themselves? And why did an ability that at first glance looks like a special gift quietly become a way of surviving life without them ever realizing it? Many people look at empaths and assume they are simply individuals born more sensitive than others, as if they entered the world with a softer heart, stronger intuition, or a more extraordinary capacity for empathy than most. But Carl Jung seemed to see the issue differently, because while he did not deny that such sensitivity was real, he always asked a deeper question. What caused a person to develop such a powerful ability to read emotions in the first place? Because sometimes what appears to be a gift on the surface actually begins as a survival mechanism at a much deeper level beneath awareness, one that even the person possessing it does not consciously recognize. This is also where many people misunderstand empaths because they think it is simply kindness, believing that empaths help others because they are too kind, too loving, or too generous. But in Jung's observations, the story was sometimes far more complex than that, because what was operating underneath was not simply kindness, but a nervous system that had learned to adapt to the world in a very particular way, much like a soldier who has lived on a battlefield for so long that even after the war has ended, their body continues reacting to the smallest sounds as if danger was still somewhere nearby. Because from very early on, many empaths seem to have learned an invisible lesson. Safety was not entirely in their own hands, but depended upon the emotional states of the people around them. If the atmosphere was peaceful, they felt safe. But if someone's tone of voice changed, if a room suddenly became tense, or if the surrounding energy shifted, something very deep within them immediately awakened, as if the body had remembered something long before the mind could understand what was happening. And over time, they began observing more than other children, listening more carefully, reading facial expressions more closely, and learning to detect tiny changes that most people around them usually overlooked. While at first this may have been only an unconscious response, over time it gradually became an entire system continuously operating within them. An ordinary child might hear a door open without giving it another thought, but an empath hears that sound and almost immediately wonders whether something might be wrong today. Another child may see their parents walking into the house as something entirely normal, but an empath notices that the footsteps sound slightly different, notices that the silence lingers longer than usual, or senses a tiny shift in tone that no one else even notices. And what becomes remarkable is that over time, this ability no longer remains a choice, but slowly becomes a reflex, because the body begins learning faster than thought itself, and the nervous system begins reacting before consciousness has time to name what is happening. Imagine a child who can sense that their father is about to become angry before he says a single word, because no words have yet been spoken. No anger has truly appeared, yet simply hearing keys turning at the door, hearing footsteps heavier than usual, or noticing an unusual silence in the room immediately tells the body that something is about to happen. What is important is that these processes rarely happen at the level of conscious thought, because the child does not sit down and tell themselves, "I need to learn how to read other people's emotions." Instead, everything happens on a much deeper level, where the nervous system learns on its own, remembers on its own, and builds reflexes on its own in order to keep itself safe. Perhaps in Greek mythology, there is an image very close to this. Cassandra, the woman gifted with the ability to see what was about to happen before others could, to perceive invisible movements no one else noticed, to see disaster before it arrived, and to sense things the rest of the world could not feel. But the tragedy of that gift was that it never brought her peace. Instead, it turned her into someone forced to constantly observe, constantly anticipate danger, and continuously live in tension with signals that others could not perceive. Perhaps many empaths live this way as well, not because they want to, but because something very deep inside them learned that failing to recognize warning signs sometimes comes with a price. Carl Jung once wrote, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents." Perhaps that quote touches something very deep here as well, because sometimes a child does not merely live their own life, but unconsciously learns to carry the emotional atmosphere of the family, learns to adapt to unresolved things, learns to feel tensions that no one names, and learns to keep the surrounding world stable, even though no one ever truly asks them to do so. Imagine this state as a radar constantly turned outward, where at first it scans for danger, but over time forgets how to turn inward, continuing to scan every signal, every subtle shift, and every small change in others until paying attention to the external world becomes the default state. And what is remarkable is that after many years, the empath may simply believe that this is their personality, believing they are merely more sensitive than others or naturally better at understanding people. But Jung seemed to want us to look a little deeper, because sometimes what appears to be a gift is actually a survival mechanism that has existed for so long that it eventually begins to feel like a person's true nature. And perhaps the saddest thing is that when a nervous system spends too many years learning how to scan the emotions of others, it often becomes extraordinarily skilled at reading the world around it, while simultaneously becoming unfamiliar with the very person living inside it. And perhaps that is where the empath's journey truly begins to change, because it is difficult for a person to become a new version of themselves if they have never realized how the old version was created in the first place. Number 3. The moment the old system collapses. And if the previous section showed how an empath spent many years learning how to survive by observing the outside world, then perhaps another question quietly begins to emerge. What happens when that way of living suddenly stops working? And what happens when the formula that helped someone survive for almost their entire life suddenly can no longer save them? There is something very strange in human psychology that Jung mentioned many times. We rarely truly see the structure we are living inside until that structure begins to crack. Because while a mechanism is still functioning, people rarely question it, rarely pause to observe it, and even more rarely ask why they live the way they do. We only begin seeing its existence once it no longer functions as it once did. And perhaps it is the same for many empaths, because for years they have lived with a formula that was almost never spoken aloud, yet silently controlled every inner decision. If I love more, if I try harder, if I sacrifice more, if I become more patient, gentler, or endure a little longer, then everything will eventually be okay. At first hearing, this sounds beautiful. It sounds like loyalty, devotion, and the kind of unconditional love that people often praise. But what becomes important is that when a belief operates long enough, it gradually stops being just a thought and slowly becomes an invisible law through which people interpret their entire lives. And for many empaths, that law often operates with a logic almost never questioned. If I give more, things will stay. If I try harder, the distance will disappear. If I love deeply enough, nothing will truly fall apart. But the problem is that every psychological structure has its limits. And what is frightening is not when a system gradually weakens over time, but when it suddenly stops working altogether, because that is the moment people discover that what they always considered truth may never have been truth at all. A friend of mine named Lisa spent nearly her whole life believing that if you loved deeply enough, love would always stay. In her relationships, she was always the one who gave more, waited more, initiated more, and almost always tried to keep things together just a little longer whenever she sensed distance beginning to appear. When the person she loved became distant, she did not think the relationship itself was changing. Instead, she immediately turned inward and wondered whether she had failed to be understanding enough. When conversations became shorter and attention faded, her first reaction was not to ask what was truly happening, but to wonder whether she could love more or try harder. Lisa began giving more and learned to leave her own pain behind because she believed that if she were patient enough, deep enough, and loving enough, everything would eventually return to how it once was. But one day, the relationship still ended, and what shattered her was not merely losing the person she loved, but the moment she realized for the first time in her life that everything she had always believed no longer worked. She loved more, yet the other person still left. She sacrificed more, yet the distance continued growing. And perhaps the most painful thing was not losing a relationship, but watching an entire formula someone had used to live for many years suddenly stop functioning. Perhaps what makes such moments so difficult to understand is not that things end, but that people often continue using the same old formula to repair a system that has already stopped working. They continue loving more when distance keeps increasing, continue trying harder when the other person has already begun pulling away, like someone rowing faster through water without realizing the boat is no longer heading in the right direction. And the painful thing is that during that stage, most people do not think the direction is wrong. They simply think they have not rowed hard enough yet. Interestingly, modern psychology has a concept very close to this called prediction error, because the human brain operates by constantly creating predictions about the surrounding world. And when reality matches what we believe, the system feels stable because the old map still works. But when reality collides too violently with foundational beliefs, especially the beliefs people use to build their way of existing in life, the brain often falls into temporary chaos because suddenly the old map can no longer explain what is happening. And perhaps this is what happens for many empaths as well, because the issue is not that they lose someone, but that for the first time in their lives, they discover that what they always believed to be truth may never have truly been true. Carl Jung once wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain." That quote perhaps has never become clearer than in moments like these, because people rarely change when everything is functioning well. We usually begin seeing our invisible structures only once they begin falling apart. And for many empaths, perhaps this is also the first time they stand before a very strange feeling. The realization that what once saved them in the past suddenly can no longer save them anymore. And perhaps the strangest thing is that in moments like these, people do not immediately realize that what just collapsed was a belief they had carried for years. At first, they simply feel confused, feel that something has become distorted, or sense that something no longer functions as before. They keep trying a little more, loving a little more, sacrificing a little more because something very deep inside still believes perhaps they simply have not done enough yet. But eventually a strange moment arrives when they begin realizing that the problem may not be that they gave too little, but that they may have lived too long by a formula that was never questioned. That is also the rare moment when an empath stands face to face with the most terrifying thing for the first time. Not losing another person, but losing certainty about the way they have lived almost their entire life. Because sometimes the greatest collapse before transformation is not the end of a relationship, but the end of the version of ourselves we once believed we had to become. And now I truly want to ask you something. Has there ever been a moment in your life when your old formula suddenly stopped working? A time when the more you tried, the more you loved, the more you sacrificed, yet nothing changed? What moment made you realize that what collapsed was not merely a relationship or circumstance, but your entire way of believing you had to live? Share your story in the comments. Perhaps what you write today may become the very thing that helps someone else realize they are not the only one walking through that collapse. Number 4. When there is nothing left outside to focus on. But sometimes what causes people to lose their direction the most is not when too many things happen at once, but when everything suddenly becomes quiet. Because after the old ways no longer work as they once did, many empaths begin facing something very strange. For the first time in many years, there is no longer anything outside themselves to continue holding on to. Perhaps Carl Jung touched upon this when he wrote, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes." Because throughout much of an empath's life, looking outward is not merely a habit, but gradually becomes the very way they orient their entire existence. They become accustomed to noticing who is struggling, accustomed to seeing what is out of place, accustomed to knowing where something needs mending, saving, or where someone needs to step in to keep things from falling apart. But what is important is that people rarely realize what they have been leaning on until it disappears. And for many empaths, true disorientation does not begin when they lose someone, but from the moment there is no one left to save. There is something very strange about people who have spent too many years directing their energy toward the outside world, because over time, they not only become accustomed to acting, but gradually become accustomed to always having something or someone to focus on. They wake up feeling the need to solve something, step into each day needing to care for someone, and almost always have somewhere to pour all of their attention. Year after year, life continues repeating in this way until it gradually becomes the default current of existence, to the point where they almost stop noticing it entirely. But what happens if one day that current suddenly disappears? Perhaps what is difficult to recognize is that a person can become completely dependent upon feeling needed without ever realizing it. Not in the sense of selfishness or a desire for attention, but in the sense that their life has functioned for so long around constantly responding to the needs of others. And over time, always having someone who needs them begins creating a kind of invisible direction, like lighthouses constantly appearing along a shoreline, until the sailor gradually forgets how to navigate once the lights suddenly disappear. During a group sharing session, I once heard the story of a man like this. For many years, he was always the person standing in the middle of every family crisis. When his younger brother struggled, he appeared. When his parents fought, he became the bridge between them. And when relatives faced difficulties in work or life, he was always the first person they called. Over time, he became the kind of person always standing at the center of things falling apart, to the point that everyone began believing he was stronger than anyone else, and slowly he himself began believing that this role naturally belonged to him. But then, a few years later, life began changing. His younger brother became more stable, his parents no longer argued as often, and the people around him gradually learned how to handle their own problems. The midnight phone calls became fewer, emergencies slowly disappeared, and strangely, instead of feeling relieved, he began feeling as if he had forgotten something very important. Every morning he picked up his phone very early, repeatedly checking whether someone had called, whether someone needed help, or whether something had happened. But there was nothing. Everything was calm. And it was precisely that calmness that caused him to lose his sense of direction. The strange thing is that sometimes people do not realize how accustomed they have become to living inside chaos until peace finally arrives, because for a very long time, constantly reacting to others has created a familiar rhythm for their lives. And when that rhythm stops, silence suddenly no longer feels like rest, but instead begins feeling like an emptiness, so vast they no longer know which direction to move toward. At first, this may sound difficult to understand, because why would someone feel unsteady when everything is finally okay? But human psychology sometimes functions in very strange ways, because after many years of living through a particular role, people become accustomed not only to acting, but to being continuously pulled in a certain direction. And when that direction disappears, they do not merely lose something to do, they temporarily lose the feeling of knowing where to go next. Perhaps the closest image to this state is that of a rower who spent many years floating with the current. Every day he rowed, moved forward, and believed he was progressing. But in truth, much of the movement came from the current itself, which had always been there. Then, one strange day, the current suddenly vanished. The boat remained. The oars were still in his hands. The sky and water seemed unchanged. But the rower suddenly realized he no longer knew where to go, because for many years he had never truly needed to create his own direction. There is something very few people realize. What causes an empath to feel most unsteady is sometimes not losing someone, but losing the thing that quietly gave them the feeling of always knowing where they needed to go and what they needed to do next. Because for many years, constantly orienting themselves toward a person, a problem, or something needing repair had slowly become a kind of invisible direction that they themselves had never even named. That is why what happens to many empaths during this stage looks nothing like what people usually imagine, because what confuses them is not that too many things suddenly appear all at once, but rather the feeling that for the first time, nothing appears anymore. No crises remain to manage. No one needs pulling back. Nothing continuously demands their presence the way it once did. And the strangest thing is that most empaths during this stage do not fully realize what is happening. They only vaguely feel that life seems to have lost a familiar direction, like someone still holding the oars in their hands, but suddenly discovering that the current they had followed for so many years is no longer there. And perhaps from that very point, a very different movement begins emerging in the journey of what empaths become after spiritual awakening. Because sometimes the first thing an empath loses after the old system collapses is not a person, but the object they use to orient almost their entire life around. Number 5. The first symptoms of beginning to live with yourself. But perhaps after an empath no longer has anything outside themselves to continue holding on to, an even stranger movement truly begins to emerge. Because when the familiar noises of the world gradually fade away, when there is no one left to save and nothing left constantly pulling attention outward, they step into a state that becomes very difficult to name, where for the first time in many years, they are forced to remain longer in the presence of themselves. Carl Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But what very few people mention is that before someone can become themselves, a very strange stage often appears first, where the initial feeling is not greater clarity, but greater unfamiliarity. Because when someone has spent too many years living through reactions to the outside world, beginning to remain with themselves does not always feel like coming home. Instead, it feels more like entering a place that is familiar, yet somehow no longer recognizable, as if they are encountering something that has always been there, but was never truly seen. What makes this stage so difficult to understand is that people usually assume unfamiliarity only appears when entering a new place, meeting a new person, or living within a new circumstance. But very few are prepared for the feeling of unfamiliarity appearing inside the very life they have already lived for years. Everything remains the same. The room remains unchanged. The habits remain unchanged. Familiar roads are still there. But somehow, the person moving through these things no longer feels like the same person, as if something very quiet has shifted inside the familiar structure of life, even though outwardly nothing seems different at all. Many people believe that after major changes in spiritual life, people immediately become more peaceful, more clear, or more connected to themselves. But for many empaths, what happens first is exactly the opposite. They begin experiencing states that are difficult to explain. There are days they wake up without truly understanding why they feel tired. There are ordinary afternoons that suddenly carry a strange emptiness, as if something is missing despite nothing bad having happened. And there are moments when they sit alone in their own familiar room, yet feel so strangely disconnected that they cannot understand why they themselves seem different, as though the person sitting in that room is still them, yet no longer entirely the version of themselves they once knew. Strangely enough, this state does not exactly resemble sadness, nor does it entirely resemble loneliness. It feels more like someone suddenly slowing down after running for too long. While running, they never noticed what was happening inside their body because all attention was focused ahead. But once they stop, for the first time, they begin hearing signals that the noise around them had always covered up. Many empaths at this stage begin asking themselves a very strange question. Why, now that everything has finally become calmer, do I not feel better? Why, now that there is less to carry and fewer people to care for, do I suddenly feel more uneasy? I am reminded of a period in the life of Princess Diana. For many years, she lived surrounded by endless attention, responsibilities, expectations, and roles the world continuously placed upon her shoulders. She became the listener, the connector, and the person into whom many others poured their hopes. Yet in many accounts of her life, one thing was often mentioned repeatedly. Even while standing among millions who loved her, she spoke many times about a feeling of emptiness and unfamiliarity that was difficult to name. Perhaps that is not exactly the same as the empath's journey, but it touches something very close. Sometimes people spend so many years being present for the world that when they finally remain with themselves, they realize they have never truly met the person living inside. That is also where many empaths begin feeling more confused than ever, because the first signs rarely appear in the dramatic way people imagine. They arrive very quietly. Someone may sit before a movie they once loved, yet no longer feel interested. They may drive down a familiar road and suddenly feel as though they are passing through a place completely unfamiliar. They continue doing exactly what they always do, yet somehow feel as if they are standing half a step outside their own life. And this is also where the first symptoms begin appearing, not dramatically, but very quietly. Someone may sit alone during an entirely ordinary evening, yet repeatedly pick up their phone and put it back down. They may turn music on only to turn it off moments later. They may walk from one room to another without truly knowing what they are looking for. Not because they need something to do, but because the silence suddenly feels too vast. That state resembles someone entering a house they have lived in for many years, knowing exactly where every door, hallway, and room is located, yet suddenly experiencing a feeling that is difficult to explain, as though everything remains exactly where it has always been, yet somehow no longer feels the same. Everything is familiar enough that it should create safety, but instead, it creates the feeling of having entered a place that is both familiar and strangely foreign. Another thing also begins appearing during this stage. Many people quickly rush to fill that space as fast as possible. They make themselves busier, find more things to do, seek more noise, or search for anything capable of pulling their attention elsewhere. Because sometimes the most frightening thing is not emptiness itself, but the feeling of remaining still long enough to realize they are standing beside someone they have never truly gotten to know. And what makes this entire stage so strange is that most empaths have absolutely no idea what is happening. They think perhaps they are simply more tired than usual. Perhaps they need to stay busier. Or perhaps this is just a strange phase that will soon pass. But what they do not realize is that for the first time in many years, they are remaining longer with their own presence, and that experience feels far more unfamiliar than anything they ever imagined. Because one of the strangest things about the journey of what empaths become after spiritual awakening is that before an empath truly becomes someone different, they usually must pass through a very quiet stage where they discover that the person they have been living with all these years has remained a stranger they have never truly met. Number 6. Story. The person who always saved others but never truly met himself. But after an empath begins spending more time remaining with their own presence, something even stranger also seems to quietly emerge. Because sometimes, the moment that changes a person most deeply is not when too many things happen, but when everything suddenly becomes so quiet that for the first time, there is nothing left outside themselves to continue moving toward. I once knew a man named Lucas, and from the outside, almost everyone thought he was the strongest person they had ever met. Lucas always appeared exactly when others needed help. For many years, his phone was almost never truly silent because friends called after breakups, co-workers reached out during stressful times, and family members called whenever something went wrong. What was strange was that Lucas was almost always there, always knew what to say, knew what to do, and somehow always seemed capable of making things feel a little better after people left. Over time, that gradually became a very natural part of Lucas's life. Nearly every day began with someone needing something. Someone needed advice. Someone needed to be heard. And others simply needed someone to help them survive a difficult period in life. Lucas never thought much about it because to him, it was simply life. He never asked himself why he was always standing in the center of other people's problems, because when something repeats long enough, people often stop seeing it. Carl Jung once wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Some things operate within people for so long that eventually they no longer resemble choices but begin feeling like destiny. Lucas lived that way too. He never sat down and consciously decided that he would spend his life becoming everyone's rescuer. He simply kept showing up, kept helping, and kept filling his life with other people's problems until one day he began believing that was who he truly was. There were years when Lucas's schedule was completely full, but strangely, most of what filled it did not actually belong to him. The mornings were phone calls from a younger brother overwhelmed by work. The afternoons were meetings with friends needing advice. And in the evenings came long conversations with people going through difficult life crises. Lucas moved from one problem to another, like a man constantly running from one burning room to the next, and because he had lived that way for so long, he began believing that perhaps this truly was who he was. But then, a very strange period began appearing, not in the form of some major crisis, and not through any dramatic collapse. No one left. Nothing fell apart. Nothing truly happened. Things simply began becoming quiet. His younger brother gradually became more stable in his work. Friends started building families of their own. The people who once depended on Lucas years earlier learned how to stand on their own feet. Midnight phone calls became fewer. Urgent messages became fewer. Even the long conversations lasting hours slowly began fading away. At first, Lucas thought it was a good thing, and truly, it was. But strangely, only a few weeks later, a feeling difficult to name began appearing. Every morning, Lucas picked up his phone out of habit, checking messages, checking calls, and checking notifications as if waiting for something to appear. But there was nothing. Everything was normal. Everything was peaceful. And it was precisely that peace that began creating a very strange emptiness. At first, Lucas did not understand what was happening. He thought perhaps he simply had too much free time. Maybe he needed more things to do. Or perhaps these were just a few strange days that would soon pass. So he tried filling his time. He took on more work, went out more often, and continuously searched for something to keep himself busy. But the feeling did not disappear. There were evenings when Lucas sat alone in his quiet apartment, turned on the television, and shut it off again only minutes later. He walked from the living room to the kitchen, and then back from the kitchen to the living room without truly knowing what he was looking for. Sometimes he stood at the window for a very long time, staring down at the street below, unable to understand why a strange heaviness had appeared inside him. A feeling not exactly like sadness, and not entirely loneliness either, but more like a nameless emptiness, quietly emerging in a place that had once always been full of noise. Jung once said that people often spend their entire lives meeting the world, while rarely ever truly meeting themselves. Lucas did not know that quote at the time, but somehow he had begun touching what Jung meant in his own way. Then one day, while sitting alone drinking coffee in the afternoon, Lucas suddenly realized something that even surprised him. He realized that for many years, almost his entire life had revolved around reacting to others. He always knew what to do when someone was suffering, always knew what to say when someone was desperate, and always knew where to go whenever a problem appeared. But what caused him to pause existed somewhere else, because when no one needed anything anymore, Lucas suddenly realized that he no longer knew where he himself was supposed to go. And for the first time in his life, a very strange thought began appearing in his mind, not arriving dramatically or like some enormous shock, but quietly emerging in the stillness of that afternoon. If no one needs me anymore, then who am I? Lucas remembered sitting with that question for a very long time, not because he found an answer, but because for the first time in many years, he realized he had never truly asked himself that question. He realized that some questions appear simple, but become strangely unfamiliar once a person has spent too much time directing all of their attention toward the outside world. For nearly his entire life, Lucas had met many people. He knew their stories, knew their pain, knew what hurt them, and knew how they tried surviving life. He had spent many years listening, understanding, and stepping into the worlds of countless other people. But then in that quiet moment, he suddenly realized a truth he did not know how to respond to. Because there was only one person Lucas had never truly met, and the strangest part was that person had always been there all along, for all those years, very close, closer than everyone he had ever tried to save. Lucas had simply never stopped long enough to truly see him. That person was himself. And what about you? If you have ever experienced a moment when something you believed for many years suddenly collapsed, leave one word in the comments. For example, collapse, awakening, lost, release, woke up, or the first word appearing in your heart right now. Sometimes just one word is enough to tell the story of an entire chapter of life. And perhaps someone reading your comment today will realize they are not the only one walking through that journey. Number 7. The true shadow of an empath is not cruelty. When an empath remains long enough within the silences they once always tried to fill, something even deeper quietly begins emerging. Because the further people move away from the familiar noise of the outside world, the easier it becomes to encounter the things long forgotten within themselves. And strangely enough, what first appears is sometimes not peace or clarity, as many imagine, but the feeling of coming face to face with parts of oneself thought to have disappeared long ago, though in truth they had only been patiently waiting to be seen. Carl Jung once wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Perhaps this is also one of his most misunderstood statements, because when people hear the word darkness, most immediately think of something frightening, negative, or destructive. But for Jung, darkness was not always cruelty, nor the evil parts people try hiding. Many times, darkness simply consisted of the unlived parts, the things pushed down for too long because at some point in life, people learned they were not allowed to carry them forward. And for empaths, this often happens in a very specific way because their shadow rarely appears in the form of a selfish, cold, or cruel person, the way many imagine. On the contrary, what becomes forgotten is often something very ordinary buried for too long. It may be anger that was never spoken. It may be needs constantly placed last. It may also be wounds that went unnamed for years because they were too busy listening to everyone else's pain. What is strange is that someone can live for a very long time without realizing those parts even exist. Because if a child learns very early that making others comfortable is more important than being honest with themselves, they gradually learn to adjust themselves. If anger makes others uncomfortable, they learn silence. If their needs create pressure within the family, they learn to shrink those needs. If their sadness makes a room heavier, they learn to say, "It's okay." And then what becomes noticeable is that after many years, "it's okay" no longer feels like a sentence. It gradually becomes a reflex. I am reminded of an image from the Bible, the story of Lazarus, who remained inside a tomb for many days before being called to step back out. What makes that image so powerful is not the miracle itself, but a very small detail. Before Lazarus emerged, he remained there for a long time in darkness. Symbolically speaking, there are parts within people much like that. They do not die. They do not disappear. They are simply placed into deep rooms and forgotten for so long that people begin believing they never existed at all. For many empaths after awakening, something strange happens. They do not merely begin meeting silence, but begin hearing things previously buried beneath the noise of the world. Someone who was always gentle may suddenly realize they are irritated without understanding why. Someone always patient may suddenly feel exhausted from pretending to be okay. Someone who has always been everyone's support system may suddenly sit in silence before a very small question. Why am I always the one who understands everyone else, yet no one has ever truly understood me? What makes this stage difficult to understand is that what appears often looks nothing like people's imagined version of spiritual transformation. It does not feel elevated. It does not create instant peace. Sometimes it even leaves people more confused than before. Because for the first time in many years, the parts buried too long begin moving again. Some people realize they have actually been angry for a long time. Others realize they have been exhausted for years. And some suddenly discover that beneath their gentle, understanding exterior, the version always showing up for others, there exists a quiet exhaustion they never truly allowed themselves to see before. What is important is that most empaths do not recognize this immediately, because the first reaction is often not awareness, but confusion. They think perhaps they are simply passing through a strange phase. They think maybe they have become more sensitive than usual, or perhaps are simply tired. Sometimes they tell themselves they only need a little more rest and everything will return to normal. But what is happening sometimes runs much deeper than that, because if a person spends too many years living through constantly responding to the outside world, they unconsciously learn how to betray themselves in very small ways. Not through major decisions or obvious choices, but through moments so quiet, almost no one notices them. It is when they say, "I'm okay," while deeply hurt. When they say, "I'm fine," while internally overwhelmed for a very long time. When they continue showing up for others, continue listening, continue supporting, and continue giving, while they themselves have almost nothing left to give. And what makes it heartbreaking is that once this repeats long enough, betrayal no longer feels like betrayal. It gradually becomes familiar, becomes a way of living, and eventually begins feeling like a person's true personality, to the point where they no longer recognize what they sacrificed along the way. Perhaps the closest image for this state is a very large house with dozens of rooms locked for many years. At first, the owner locks only a few doors because they think they do not need them. But as years pass, they continue locking more rooms, continue ignoring more spaces, until one day they live only in a tiny corner of their own house. And strangely, they gradually forget that behind those closed doors remain many parts of themselves still waiting there. That is also what is deeply unique about the journey of what empaths become after spiritual awakening. Because sometimes the first thing an empath truly encounters after awakening is not a higher version of themselves, but the forgotten parts returning, not to destroy them, but to remind them that there are still parts of themselves that have never truly been allowed to live. And sometimes the most frightening thing is not encountering darkness, but the moment a person realizes that what they called darkness all these years was actually just parts of themselves standing there all along, quietly waiting to be seen and finally allowed to exist. Number 8. The first new ability, no longer absorbing everything. What would happen if an empath still retained the ability to feel everything deeply as before, still notice the things others usually miss, but for the first time in their life, no longer allowed every emotion passing by to automatically walk straight inside them? Because sometimes the greatest change after awakening is not feeling less, but finally learning how to feel without absorbing everything. Carl Jung once wrote, "The difference between a good life and a bad life is how well you walk through the fire." What is interesting is that many people assume change after awakening will arrive as a new power, a dramatic transformation, or an immediate feeling of becoming different. But for many empaths, the first change comes in a much quieter way than they ever imagined, because it does not make them feel less, does not make them colder, and does not take away the ability to connect deeply that has always been such a significant part of who they are. What changes happen somewhere much more subtle because they still feel everything as before, but they no longer absorb everything automatically the way they once did. For many years, many empaths lived as though no boundary existed between themselves and the world. The moment someone entered a room carrying emotional heaviness, they almost instantly felt it. The moment a slight tension arose between two strangers, they noticed it. Sometimes a glance, a silence lingering a few seconds longer than usual, or a very small shift in someone's voice was enough to create quiet movements within them. What is strange is that most of these things happened so quickly, they never even realized they were doing it, because sensing others had long ago stopped being a choice and gradually became an almost natural reflex. But after a very long journey of transformation, a very small change begins appearing. It does not arrive as a major event, nor does it appear in a way immediately noticeable at first. Instead, it happens so quietly that almost no one notices when it begins. An empath walks into a room and still senses heaviness in the atmosphere, still notices someone is exhausted, and still knows when someone is hiding something behind their ordinary appearance. But instead of immediately being pulled into that movement the way they once were, for the first time, there appears a very small pause between feeling and absorbing. At first, that may sound far too small to create any difference, but sometimes an entire life changes because of a distance that short. I once knew a woman named Amelia. For many years, she worked at a psychological rehabilitation center, and co-workers often said Amelia possessed a very unusual ability to sense others. She almost always knew who was pretending to be okay while secretly falling apart, knew when someone was hiding exhaustion, and was often the first person to notice things almost everyone else completely missed. But what no one knew was that after each workday, Amelia often returned home in a state of exhaustion she herself could not understand. Some days, she sat in her car for a very long time before stepping out. Some evenings, she returned to her apartment and simply lay still for hours without understanding why her body felt so heavy. She once believed she was simply too sensitive, or assumed that this was merely the price of understanding too many people. Until many years later, after experiencing enormous changes in her spiritual life, Amelia began realizing something strange. She still entered work as before, still met the same familiar people, and still felt everything deeply. But for the first time in many years, she no longer carried all of those things home with her. At first, Amelia did not even realize what was happening. It was not until one afternoon while driving home that she suddenly noticed herself listening to music and unconsciously singing along with an old song. For most people, that would have been entirely ordinary, but for Amelia, the moment felt so strange she burst into laughter, because she could not remember the last time she returned home without carrying someone else's heaviness with her. Interestingly, modern neuroscience also touches something very close to this experience. In many studies on empathy, scientists have discovered that the human brain possesses emotional mirroring systems, allowing us to feel and understand the states of others with remarkable speed. But what creates the difference is not whether feeling happens or not, but the ability to distinguish what belongs to us and what belongs to others. When that ability weakens, people easily absorb the experiences around them as if all of it belongs to them. But when awareness begins changing, the system does not disappear. It simply begins functioning in a different way. And it is precisely here that the image of the empath begins changing. Because for many years, they resembled a giant sponge placed in the middle of life, quietly absorbing everything passing through them: joy, pain, tension, anxiety, and even the things others never spoke aloud. At first, that made them feel deeper, more connected, and more understanding. But after too many years, they began living like a sponge that had absorbed so much water, it forgot its own true weight. But then one very strange day, a quiet shift begins appearing. It does not arrive as an explosive moment or an obvious transformation, but unfolds very slowly, very gently, and almost invisibly. What changes is not that their ability to feel disappears, nor that the world suddenly becomes lighter. What changes lies in how things move through them. The sponge that once absorbed everything begins becoming a filter, where the water still flows, movement still happens, and sensitivity never disappears. But for the first time in many years, not everything passing through remains inside. That is also what makes the journey of what empaths become after spiritual awakening so unique. Because after awakening, an empath does not become colder or more distant, as many people assume. They still feel deeply, still notice the things others overlook, and still recognize the smallest movements in the world around them with the sensitivity that has always belonged to them. But for the first time in many years, they begin understanding a completely different truth. Feeling something does not mean they must become the container for it. And sometimes the first new ability after awakening is not seeing more, feeling more intensely, or understanding others more deeply, but something much smaller that changes everything. They finally begin learning how not to carry everything with them anymore. Number 9. Why other people think empaths become cold. Something very strange begins happening to many empaths after awakening, because the moment they slowly stop carrying the entire world inside themselves the way they once did, the people around them are often the first to notice the change. But the irony is that they rarely see the transformation the way the empath is actually experiencing it, because what is happening inside is often deeper, quieter, and very different from what appears on the surface. For many years, the people around them had grown accustomed to a very specific version of the empath. They became used to the person who always replied quickly, used to the person who always appeared whenever someone needed help, and used to the feeling that no matter what happened, there would always be a place to return to, someone to call, or someone willing to sit and listen without ever appearing tired. Over time, this repeated so often that it almost became an invisible law. No one ever sat down and consciously decided things would be that way, but somehow time gradually transformed the empath's unconditional presence into something expected, as if it had always been meant to exist that way. What is important is that people become very accustomed to whatever remains constantly beside them. We rarely notice air until breathing becomes difficult. We rarely think about light until a room suddenly grows dark. And in exactly the same way, many people only realize how enormous an empath's presence truly was at the moment it begins changing, because sometimes people only recognize the value of something once they feel its slightest movement. A female viewer named Eleanor once shared with the channel that for many years she had almost become the emotional center of her entire friend group. When someone experienced a breakup, they called Elena. When someone felt lost, Elena appeared. When someone needed to be heard at 2 in the morning, Elena was always there. She remembered every birthday, remembered the smallest events in other people's lives, and almost always knew exactly what to say at exactly the right moment. But then, after a period of profound changes in her life, something very quiet began happening. Elena still listened, still cared, and still remained present, but she no longer threw herself into every movement around her in the old way, as though something inside had begun changing the direction of its own operation. At first, nobody said anything to Elena, but over time, small comments began appearing one by one. Someone said, "You've changed lately." Someone laughed and casually remarked, "I don't know why, but you feel more distant somehow." Someone even stared at her for a long moment before asking a question that made Elena fall silent. "Are you okay? You're not like your old self anymore." The strange thing is that comments like these often confuse empaths far more than people realize, because they know very well that they do not hate anyone more, do not love people less, and do not truly want to move away from anyone. The only thing changing is the way they exist in this world. But the problem is that most people do not see the silent process unfolding inside. They do not see the internal movements, do not see what has changed in the way a person experiences life. They only see the final result appearing on the surface. Carl Jung once wrote, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." What is fascinating about that quote is that sometimes people not only avoid facing themselves, but unconsciously seek out those always willing to carry part of their burden. And when someone becomes too accustomed to having another person absorb, listen, or support them, that person's change is sometimes not seen as growth, but felt as loss. This reminds me of an image of a house standing in the middle of a city with a door that remained open for many years. Anyone walking by could step inside to rest, avoid the rain, or stay for a while. And because that door remained open for so many years, people gradually forgot it was not a public square belonging to the city, but the home of an actual person. Then, one ordinary day, that door does not close completely, but begins closing just a little, not to reject anyone, but simply because the person living inside has finally begun returning home, to live within their own house. But the people outside rarely see that. What they see is only that the door is no longer wide open. And from that very moment, the change becomes easily misunderstood in ways even the empath themselves never expected. What is important is that many empaths during this stage begin experiencing a very quiet internal conflict. One part of them feels lighter in a way difficult to explain, as if for the first time in many years, they no longer have to carry so many things that never truly belong to them. But at the same time, another part begins asking strange questions. They wonder whether they are becoming more selfish, whether they are becoming colder, or whether they are losing the most beautiful version of themselves they once believed they were. Because for many years, they became accustomed to equating love with unlimited presence, equating kindness with always being available, and equating their value with always appearing whenever others needed them. Over time, they also became familiar with believing that if someone felt disappointed, sad, or sensed distance appearing, then perhaps they must have done something wrong. But after awakening, something very strange begins appearing. they can no longer fully return to their old version of themselves. Not because they do not want to, but because once a person sees something very deep inside themselves, it becomes difficult to continue living as if they had never seen it. And perhaps the most painful thing is that empaths are often misunderstood most deeply precisely when they begin truly changing. Not when they are chaotic, not when they are falling apart, and not when life is going off course, but when they simply begin living a little differently. Because the world has become too accustomed to the version that always says, "Okay," always appears at the right moment, and always opens itself for everyone else to enter. That is why, when that version begins changing, the first response from the outside world is not always understanding. It may be surprise. It may be disappointment. Or sometimes, it may simply be one short sentence capable of leaving many empaths silent for a very long time. "You've changed." This may be one of the strangest moments in the empath's journey after awakening, because sometimes what hurts an empath most is not changing themselves, but realizing that the people around them loved a version of them for so long that when their true self finally begins shifting, that change becomes interpreted as distance, coldness, or as though something valuable has been lost. But sometimes what truly disappears is not love at all, but only the unlimited access the world once assumed it would always have. So we have now traveled more than halfway through this journey, and I want to thank you for your deeply meaningful presence. Before continuing, pause for a moment, take a slow breath, and listen to the rhythm of your own heartbeat. If anything in this video helped you recognize a part of yourself, leave a like on the video. Sometimes one small click does more than spread this message further. It also helps those quietly walking through their own transformation realize that they are not alone on that path. Number 10. The collapse of the rescuer instinct. If in the previous stage the empath began realizing that the world no longer saw them the way it once did, then something even deeper also slowly begins to emerge. What happens if the very thing that once made them constantly rush toward other people's pain suddenly begins collapsing from within? Carl Jung once wrote, "Neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering." What is fascinating about this quote is that sometimes people do not truly face their deepest pain, but unconsciously create other movements to avoid touching it. And for many empaths, constantly rescuing others is sometimes not merely kindness, but a far more complex psychological movement, where continuously fixing, continuously showing up, and continuously pulling someone out of darkness gradually becomes a way to avoid sitting too long with the empty spaces inside themselves. For many years, many empaths could hardly tolerate seeing others suffer, because the moment someone became even slightly sad, they immediately felt as though something inside them was being pulled tight. The moment a loved one experienced hardship, a friend became hopeless, or someone simply entered a room carrying visible heartbreak on their face, they almost instantly stepped into a very familiar state of movement, where everything inside began pushing them to do something, say something, or fix something, as if no matter what happened, they needed to pull everything back towards stability as quickly as possible. At first glance, that truly resembles compassion. It resembles kindness, generosity, and sounds almost like love in its most beautiful form, the kind people often praise. But Carl Jung was usually very careful with things that looked too beautiful on the surface, because he always tended to look deeper into what was operating beneath human behavior, rather than stopping at what appeared externally. And through this, Jung realized that some people do not simply want to help others, but seem unable to tolerate standing still in the presence of another person's pain. Although these two things appear similar on the surface, at deeper psychological levels, they are completely different movements. There is a very small, yet extremely important difference here. Someone may see a person drowning and extend a hand to pull them out because of love, concern, or compassion, naturally arising from the heart. But there are also people who immediately jump into the water, not necessarily because they consciously chose to help, but because they cannot tolerate standing on the shore while watching someone continue sinking before their eyes. In the second case, the movement is no longer simply helping. It begins becoming an urge. What makes this difficult to recognize is that empaths often live with that urge for so long that they begin believing it is their true nature. They believe they were born to save others, believe they are stronger than others, believe constantly showing up is natural. But sometimes what people call personality is simply a psychological mechanism repeated too many times. I am reminded of a period in the life of Oprah Winfrey. For many years, she became a place where millions came to be heard, healed, and seen. She sat before countless stories of pain, heartbreak, and loss. She showed up for so many people that the world almost assumed her role was to carry others. But in many conversations about her inner life, Oprah mentioned something fascinating. There were periods when she began realizing that constantly having to show up for everyone sometimes created an exhaustion difficult to name, because there is a profound difference between choosing to be present and feeling obligated to always be present. That makes me think of a very strange image. Imagine a firefighter who spent his entire life running from one fire to another. For many years he woke to alarm sirens, ran to rescue people, and then continued running elsewhere. Gradually, those sirens became the rhythm of his life. Then one day, the city becomes quiet. No more alarms, no more smoke, no more places to run. And strangely, instead of feeling relieved the way he once imagined, the firefighter begins feeling a panic difficult to explain. Because sometimes what people unconsciously become dependent upon is not chaos itself, but the feeling of always knowing where they need to go, what they need to do, and how they need to respond to the world around them. That is also where many empaths begin entering a unique stage after awakening, because they still see other people's pain, still notice tiny things others often overlook, but for the first time in many years, they no longer immediately rush toward every visible fracture the instant they see it. Not because they love less, not because they become colder, and certainly not because empathy disappears from them. It is simply that in a very quiet way, a small pause begins appearing where previously every reaction happened almost instantly. Strangely enough, that very small pause confuses many people more than they expect, because for many years, everything inside them moved so quickly that almost no space existed between feeling and acting. But now, for the first time, another question begins appearing before stepping into the familiar role. Do I truly want to help this person? Or can I simply not tolerate standing still while someone suffers? What is important is that when the rescuer instinct begins collapsing, many empaths unconsciously assume that something inside them is breaking. They feel guilty when they no longer react immediately the way they once did. They feel unfamiliar to themselves when they no longer automatically run toward places full of pain and collapse. And sometimes what confuses them most is a very quiet fear. Am I losing the most beautiful part of myself? But Carl Jung would likely view all of this very differently, because in his psychology, maturity does not appear when people learn to help more, sacrifice more, or carry more burdens for others. It begins in the moment they slow down enough to see what is truly operating behind the need to always help. Sometimes the first thing that truly collapses after awakening is not relationships, not old ways of seeing the world, nor the roles that once defined people. It is the instinct to always run and save everyone else before turning back toward oneself. Because in the end, the strangest thing is not that the empath stops rescuing others, but the moment they pause long enough to ask a question that had never appeared before. If I no longer need to save anyone, then what inside me has been quietly waiting to be saved? Number 11. Story: the woman who for the first time did not run to save anyone. However, if in the previous section, an empath began realizing that the need to rescue others sometimes does not arise solely from kindness, but from an unconscious movement that followed them for many years, then an even stranger moment eventually appears. The moment life places them in a deeply familiar situation, yet they respond in a completely different way from the person they once were. I once knew a woman named Sophia, and from the outside, almost everyone around her shared the same impression. Whenever something happened, Sophia would appear. Friends called her after breakups. Her younger sister turned to her whenever life became chaotic. Co-workers texted whenever they felt overwhelmed. Strangely enough, Sophia almost never truly refused anyone, not because she was never tired, nor because she always had time, but because deep inside her existed a familiar reflex. If someone is suffering, I must be there. Years passed, and gradually this became a very natural part of Sophia's life. Her phone ringing meant someone needed her. A late-night call usually came attached to some story of heartbreak. A text message often carried the feeling that something required immediate attention. Over time, her body itself seemed to learn how to react before thought arrived. The moment a notification sounded at unusual hours, something inside Sophia almost instantly awakened, as though it had known what needed to happen long before reason even appeared. Then, one very ordinary night, around 1 in the morning, Sophia's phone suddenly rang. She opened her eyes inside the dark room. Outside the window, the city had almost completely fallen asleep. The only light remaining came from the glowing phone screen beside her bed. It was Emma, her closest friend. Sophia stared at the name on the screen for a long time. In the past, she would likely have sat upright immediately, heart racing, while endless questions instantly appeared. What happened? Is it serious? What do I need to say? What should I do? Do I need to go there right now? Because for many years, everything had always worked that way. So quickly that almost no space existed between realizing someone was suffering and rushing toward them. But strangely, that night things did not happen that way. Sophia still stared at the glowing phone screen in the darkness, still felt familiar worry move through her body, and still knew that on the other side of the line there was likely a suffering person needing someone to listen. Yet for the first time in many years, a very small silence suddenly appeared between feeling and action, a pause so brief that in the past she probably never would have noticed it existed at all. And inside that tiny silence, something very strange happened. Sophia did not reach for the phone the way she always had. She did not immediately sit up, did not rush to call back, and did not instantly step into the familiar role of the person who always fixed things before they became worse. She simply sat there in the darkness for a long time, as though for the first time in her life she was no longer reacting faster than her own thoughts. Carl Jung once wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." Sophia had never read that quote at the time, but years later she said that moment was the first time she saw something very small she had never seen before. She realized that for many years her reactions had always arrived too quickly, so quickly that she had never truly seen what happened between another person's pain and the movement inside herself, as though she had spent much of her life living through reflexes, without ever pausing long enough to see what silently pushed her beneath the surface. And that night, for the first time, she saw it. Sophia realized that the instant her phone vibrated, a very familiar feeling immediately appeared inside her. It was not exactly love, nor entirely kindness the way she had always imagined. It felt more like a quiet tension, as though something inside was pushing her to stand up immediately, show up, do something, and fix something before it became too late. But for the first time in her life, Sophia did not follow that movement. She simply sat still. Outside the window, the city remained quiet. The clock continued moving, and eventually the phone screen went dark, while Sophia leaned against the headboard and suddenly realized something very strange. Something so small she never thought she would notice it. She did not feel guilty, and that was precisely what confused her most. Because for many years, missing a call, replying too slowly, or failing to appear exactly when someone needed her almost instantly filled her with heaviness. Something deep inside always believed that if she was not there, if she did not show up, or if she failed to do something immediately, then she had done something wrong. But that feeling was absent that night. No panic, no sensation of abandoning someone, only silence. And that silence almost made Sophia cry, not because of pain or despair, but because for the first time in many years, she realized she was sitting alone without trying to run anywhere at all. The next morning, Emma called back. It turned out she had simply gone through a major argument and wanted someone to talk to. The two of them still sat together that afternoon. Sophia still listened, still showed up, and still remained there as she always had. But in a way difficult to describe, she knew something had changed. It was very small, very hard to see, and perhaps nobody around her noticed it. But Sophia knew with complete certainty that a new movement had appeared inside her. Years later, she said that night was the first time she understood something very strange. Sometimes people are not truly addicted to saving others. What they become addicted to is the feeling of always needing someone to save. And sometimes the moment transformation begins does not appear when people learn how to run faster toward others, but when for the first time they sit still long enough to realize the world does not collapse simply because they did not immediately rush forward. And perhaps this is one of the quietest moments in the journey of what empaths become after spiritual awakening. Because sometimes the first thing that changes is not how an empath loves others, but the moment they discover that they can still love someone deeply, even when they no longer run to rescue them. Number 12. When buried anger returns. But what happens if, after stopping the habit of running out to save everyone, the first thing to return is not peace, but an emotion buried so deeply and for so long that even the empath no longer remembers ever carrying it? Carl Jung once wrote, "What you resist not only persists, but will grow in size." What is interesting about this quote is that it touches something very deep within the journey of many empaths after awakening. Because sometimes what frightens people is not the appearance of an emotion, but the fact that for the first time they no longer know what to do with it. For many years, many empaths have lived with a silent belief that a good person should not become too angry, should not remain upset for too long, and certainly should not allow intense emotions to hurt others. Over time, this belief gradually stopped being merely a thought and slowly became an invisible law operating inside them, to the point that whenever anger appeared, their first reaction was almost never to listen to it, but to push it away as quickly as possible. What is important is that anger never truly disappears simply because people refuse to allow it to exist. In modern psychology, many studies on emotional suppression suggest that when an emotion is repeatedly blocked instead of acknowledged, the nervous system does not simply erase it, but often stores it deeper within. Emotions left unprocessed continue existing in the form of quiet tension, prolonged exhaustion, or strange reactions surfacing many years later. The brain may prevent an emotion from entering awareness, but that does not mean the body stops remembering it. And perhaps that is also what happens to many empaths after awakening. Once old roles begin collapsing, once they stop constantly chasing the needs of the outside world, a very strange space begins appearing. And that space creates the conditions for things buried too long to begin moving again. And sometimes the first thing returning is not peace nor light, but an emotion they spent many years learning how to avoid. I once knew a man named Daniel. From the outside, Daniel was almost the type of person everyone loved, because he was always patient, calm, and almost always the first person to appear whenever someone needed help. Co-workers enjoyed working with him, friends turned to him whenever life became difficult, and for many years, almost no one had ever truly seen Daniel become angry. Daniel himself believed this was his most beautiful quality. He often said that he disliked conflict, disliked tension, and always wanted people around him to feel more comfortable in his presence. Over time, both those around him and Daniel himself gradually began believing that this was simply who he truly was. But after a period of profound changes in his spiritual life, Daniel began noticing very strange things appearing. Ordinary conversations irritated him longer than before. Very small things created frustration lasting for hours. Some mornings, he woke up carrying a heaviness he could not explain, and strangely, the more he tried remaining calm, the clearer those feelings became, as though something buried too long beneath the surface had begun slowly making its way upward. At first, Daniel thought perhaps he was simply tired or passing through a strange phase that would eventually disappear. But then, one very ordinary afternoon, while standing in line waiting for coffee, a man in front of him accidentally cut in line. The event was so small that the old Daniel probably would not even have noticed. But that time something suddenly erupted inside him with such force that he frightened himself. not because the other man had done something serious, but because for the first time, Daniel felt truly angry. What scared him was not the anger itself, but the realization that he had never believed he was capable of feeling that way. Daniel stood there looking at himself as though staring at a stranger, because the first question appearing in his mind was not, "Why am I angry?" but something far more frightening. What kind of person am I becoming? And perhaps that is also what happens to many empaths after awakening, because for many years they have grown accustomed to seeing themselves as the understanding one, the gentle one, and the one always calmer than everyone around them. But then one day, the parts buried too long begin returning, and what becomes frightening is not their appearance, but the fact that the empath suddenly no longer recognizes themselves. It reminds me of the image of a basement room locked for decades. At first, the owner locks it because they think they no longer need it. But as the years pass, they gradually forget it even exists. Then, one ordinary day, the door suddenly swings open. The frightening part is not that monsters exist inside. The frightening part is realizing that behind that door were always things belonging to their own house. For many empaths, anger resembles that room. It is not something foreign, not some terrifying darkness, and not something coming from somewhere else. It is simply a part of themselves that remained in darkness for too long. What makes that moment difficult to understand is that most empaths never learned to see anger as a signal. For many years, they viewed it only as something needing control, calming, or pushing away as quickly as possible. They learned to smile while hurting, learned to say everything was okay while feeling heavy inside, and gradually became so accustomed to this that whenever anger appeared, their first reaction was not listening to what it was trying to say, but immediately asking, "Is something wrong with me?" But sometimes anger does not appear to destroy us. Sometimes it arrives only as a delayed signal from parts that remained silent too long, parts finally unable to remain hidden in darkness any longer. And this may also be one of the strangest moments in the journey, because what returns is not always the peace people imagined, nor a gentler or brighter version of themselves, but emotions buried too long finally beginning to speak again after years of silence. Because sometimes what frightens an empath most is not anger itself, but the realization that for many years they never truly allowed themselves permission to feel angry in the first place. In your opinion, what hurts more? Losing someone once deeply important to you, or losing certainty about the way you have lived almost your entire life? Share your thoughts in the comments. Perhaps your answer will touch someone else standing in that same moment where everything they once believed is beginning to change. Number 13. Integrating opposites. Being soft and strong at the same time. At this point, after all of those intense inner movements, a very strange question quietly begins to emerge. What happens if the parts that had been pushed down for so long finally return? But instead of pulling a person to continue swinging between extreme softness and extreme hardness, they begin learning how to coexist within an entirely new structure? Carl Jung once wrote, "The pendulum of the mind oscillates between sense and nonsense, not between right and wrong." What is remarkable about this quote is that Jung seemed to view inner life as a continuous movement between opposing forces, rather than a battle where one side must defeat the other. Yet many people imagine the journey of growth as gradually removing the contradictory parts within themselves, as if becoming developed enough means keeping only light and abandoning darkness, keeping gentleness while removing strength, or preserving reason while gradually distancing themselves from emotion. But Jung saw human beings in a completely different way, because for him, maturity was not the victory of one half of the self over another, but the ability for opposing parts to coexist without continuously pulling a person between extreme ends. Perhaps this is also what begins happening for many empaths after awakening. For many years before that, their lives often operated through intense swings that they themselves barely noticed. There were periods when they became so soft that they almost dissolved into the emotions of others. They understood, they yielded, they absorbed, and they continuously expanded themselves until they almost no longer knew where the boundary between themselves and others existed. But then there were also moments after too much pain when they suddenly swung to the opposite extreme, becoming more closed off, harder, and creating distance from everything as a way of protecting themselves. The strange thing is that although those two states look completely different, they share one thing in common. They are both extreme reactions. One side continuously opens itself until it disappears into other people, while the other continuously withdraws until almost no one can enter anymore. And many empaths spend years moving back and forth between those two states without understanding why they always seem to swing like that. I remember a very special image from The Little Prince. The little prince meets the lamplighter on his tiny planet, a man who continuously turns the lamp on and off according to an outdated order, even though the world around him had changed long ago. What made that image so special was that the man was not evil, nor was he doing anything wrong. He simply continued repeating a movement for so long that he forgot to stop and ask whether it still made sense anymore. In some way, many empaths live like that too. They continuously move between softness and hardness, between giving and withdrawing, between openness and defense, until they forget that another way of living might exist somewhere in between. I once heard an old Zen story about a student asking his teacher, "Should I become soft like water or steady like stone?" The Zen master looked at him for a long time and smiled. "Water is soft, yet water cuts through stone. Stone is hard, yet time wears stone down. Why must you choose?" The student did not understand at that moment, but years later he realized that the answer had never been about becoming one thing or the other. Sometimes the hardest thing is learning how two things that seem opposite can coexist without needing to eliminate each other. There comes a stage after awakening when many empaths begin realizing this in a very quiet way. They discover that they are still gentle as before, but no longer melt into every emotion passing through them. They still care, but no longer lose themselves in the process. They can still remain soft, while simultaneously beginning to feel a strange kind of strength emerging underneath, as if for the first time in their lives, they no longer have to choose between loving others and keeping themselves. What is fascinating is that modern psychology touches something very close to this experience. Long-term psychological development research suggests that maturity does not appear when people eliminate the opposing parts within themselves, but when the brain begins holding multiple states at once without perceiving them as threats. A person can be strong and vulnerable, rational and emotional, soft and firm, and that capacity to tolerate complexity often becomes a sign of a more mature inner structure. This is also where a very quiet shift begins inside many empaths, because in the past, they often lived as though every different part inside them had to compete for the right to exist. When gentleness appeared, they believed they had to suppress strength. When strength appeared, they feared losing softness. They continuously edited themselves, continuously leaned toward one side, and continuously tried to become the version they thought was more correct. But after so many swings, a very quiet realization begins to emerge. Perhaps the problem was never who they were, but that for too long they had only allowed one part of themselves to live. What is remarkable is that when this balance begins to form, many empaths do not feel dramatically different. They do not wake up one morning suddenly feeling completely transformed. On the contrary, the feeling often arrives very softly, like a quiet stability emerging underneath all movement. They are still the same person, still sensitive as before, still feeling deeply and still moved by the world. But for the first time in many years, they no longer feel continuously pulled toward opposite extremes. That state of balance does not arrive as a fixed destination, but more like a living process, because there will still be days when an empath feels pulled more strongly toward one side, and there will still be moments when old softness returns too intensely, or old hardness suddenly appears as a familiar reaction. But unlike before, they no longer panic when it happens. They no longer immediately think they are returning to an old version of themselves or heading in the wrong direction, because after many collisions with life, they begin understanding that maturity is not becoming someone who never wavers, but learning how to remain calm enough within those movements without losing themselves. And perhaps for the first time after so many years, they stop trying to become a more perfect version of themselves and begin learning how to become a more whole human being, where the parts that once opposed one another no longer have to continue fighting for the right to exist. Number 14. The emergence of the inner witness. At this point, after all the collapses, the quiet shifts, and the forgotten parts gradually returning, one final movement also begins to appear, as if the entire journey before this had silently led to this moment. What happens when an empath is no longer swept away by everything they feel, and for the first time in life, a very quiet part begins appearing inside them that can stand still and observe everything unfolding? Carl Jung once wrote, "I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become." What is fascinating is that many people hear this quote and immediately think of becoming a better, stronger, or more perfect version of themselves, as though at the end of the journey a wiser person is always waiting somewhere ahead. But Jung seemed to see things differently, because sometimes becoming oneself does not begin with creating another new identity, but with the moment people stop completely identifying with everything that happened to them, stop dissolving into every emotion, every experience, and every movement passing through them, and begin seeing the one who had always been there from the very beginning. And for many empaths after awakening, that change does not appear as some dramatic transformation, but arrives as a very small distance, small enough to completely alter their entire inner life. Before, if sadness appeared, they became that sadness. If someone walked in carrying anxiety, they were pulled into that state. If a room was filled with tension, their body almost instantly merged with that atmosphere before the mind could even understand what was happening. Every emotion resembled rushing water pouring down, and they did not stand beside the current. They were always inside it. They were carried away, pulled away, and often only realized where they had gone after the current had already taken them very far. But then, after many quiet inner movements, a very strange change begins appearing. Not because the world becomes lighter, not because emotions disappear, and not because they suddenly become less sensitive. The change occurs somewhere very difficult to see, because for the first time, a small space appears between emotion and the person experiencing it. Very small. So small that at first, many people do not even realize it exists. During a Jungian therapy session, I once met a woman named Clara. For many years, Clara had lived with the feeling that everything happening around her moved directly into her inner world. If a co-worker entered carrying heaviness, her entire day changed. If someone became more distant than usual, she spent hours thinking about it. If someone she loved remained silent longer than normal, her mind almost instantly created endless stories to fill the empty space. She once said there were days when she felt as though she were living inside dozens of different people all at once, because the emotions of the world around her always moved through her without ever encountering a single doorway. But years later, Clara said there was one very ordinary morning while sitting in a cafe when she suddenly felt a familiar sadness appear. In the past, she would immediately sink into it. She would try finding the cause, try fixing it, or try escaping it as quickly as possible. But this time something was different. She simply sat still, sat there for a very long time. And for the first time in her life, a very small thought suddenly appeared. I am feeling sadness, but I am not this sadness. That makes me think of a very strange image. Imagine a person who spent an entire lifetime in the middle of a river for so long that they forgot what standing on solid ground even felt like. For years, they were continuously carried away by the water, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, sometimes violent, sometimes gentle, and because they remained inside that current for so long, they began believing that was life itself. But then one very ordinary day, that person steps onto the shore. The river still flows, the water still moves, nothing disappears. But for the first time they stand somewhere different. For the first time they see the river instead of becoming it. That was also something Jung recognized in the deeper movements of human psychology. He believed that eventually the self begins quietly reorganizing inner life, not by removing emotions or extinguishing inner turbulence, but by creating a center strong enough that people are no longer dissolved into everything they experience. Not the distance of coldness, not the distance of indifference, but the distance of awareness. Interestingly, modern neuroscience also touches something very close to this experience. Some studies on awareness suggest that when the capacity to observe internal states becomes stronger, brain activity begins changing in such a way that people no longer react completely automatically to every emotional signal. What appears is not emotional numbness, but a very small pause between experience and reaction. And sometimes all inner freedom begins from that tiny pause. This is also where many empaths begin experiencing a change difficult to describe. They still feel sadness, but no longer drown completely inside it. They still feel anxiety, but are no longer dragged all the way to the end of every fearful path. They still feel everything around them deeply, but for the first time in many years, they begin seeing what is happening, rather than instantly becoming it. What is even more profound is that this state rarely arrives feeling like victory. Many imagine that when this happens, they will instantly feel stronger or clearer. But in reality, it is usually very quiet, very gentle. Like someone who spent too many years living in a room full of noise, suddenly stepping into a place so silent, they initially do not know what they are hearing. And then slowly, very slowly, they realize that what they are hearing is not the silence of the world. It is the presence of themselves. And after everything that happened, perhaps this becomes the deepest change of all. Not that the empath feels less, not that they become a different kind of person, but for the first time in many years, among all the movements of life, a very quiet witness begins appearing inside, a part capable of watching everything come and go without disappearing along with it. Because sometimes, the ending of a journey is not about becoming someone else, but about the moment people finally stop drifting, with every current passing through their lives, and stand still long enough to realize that the person they searched for throughout the entire journey had never been far away. That person had always been there, quietly waiting inside, waiting for the day they would finally be seen. Looking back across the entire journey we have just traveled, perhaps one thing begins becoming clearer. What happens to empaths after awakening is not some mystical upgrade, nor the process of becoming a completely different person. For many years, many people believed awakening would make them more peaceful, lighter, or finally transform them into the ideal version they had always been searching for. But what emerges is often deeper and far more real. Instead of becoming someone else, the empath gradually stops living entirely through the eyes, emotions, and needs of the outside world, and for the first time learns how to return to the center of themselves. Carl Jung believed that people do not become whole by removing difficult or contradictory parts inside themselves, but by becoming courageous enough to see all of them and give each one its rightful place within their inner life. And that is also what many empaths finally begin learning after this long journey. Not how to feel less, not how to love less, but how to exist without losing themselves in the process of loving the world. If something in this video touched you, share it with someone exhausted from always being the strong one, always being the listener, always being the place everyone returns to while forgetting how to return to themselves. And if you want to continue joining us on this journey into the depths of Carl Jung's psychology, the quiet movements of the soul, and the path back toward the true self, subscribe to the channel so you do not miss future videos. Because sometimes the most important journey is not traveling far away in search of yourself, but finally becoming brave enough to stay and truly meet the person who has always been living within you.